I believe we left off last week in chapter 17, if I'm not mistaken. Did we get into chapter 17? It's been 2 weeks since I've taught. Did we even enter chapter 17? Nobody say anything, so I'm going to assume we didn't. So I know we got through chapter 16. So we'll go ahead and just start off with verse 1 of chapter 17, which, of course, 3 whole chapters of Revelation, beginning here, 17, 18, and 19. 17, 18, and 19 give us the details of what took place in chapter 16. There is a battle of some sort that is going to happen, and that battle is really no battle at all. In other words, the outcome has already been announced before the battle's even fought. And as you will see, once the details of the battle are given, there's no contest to it. And it also has nothing at all to do with what premillennialism stresses. Now, one reason why I keep on bringing up premillennialism is because that is the predominant approach in religion today concerning the book of Revelation. That is to say that it all has to do with some future conflict between the United States and Russia and China and all these other countries that will take place in Israel. I never will forget, right before the first Gulf War in 1990, I was preaching my first full-time work out in Walker County, Alabama, at Quintown Church of Christ. If you know where Quintown is, then you get a gold star, because Quintown is a spot in the map. But anyway, Quintown is a great congregation to start out with, great group of people, great eldership. We had a radio program each week on one of the local radio stations. And so when all of this started happening in the Gulf, there was these preachers that got on the air and said, "Oh, this is all fulfillment of Bible prophecy. This is what Revelation says. In other words, there's going to be a great battle of Armageddon coming, and all this is just building up toward it. Saddam Hussein is the beast," and all this stuff. So I got on the air and I said, "Folks, this is simply not true." And the reason why I know it's not true is because the Bible doesn't teach this, and just was pretty direct about it. And some of those preachers didn't like that because it went against their orthodoxy, what they've always taught and always preached. But the fact is, you know, all of the events happened as they happened in the Gulf, the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. Didn't turn out at all like these guys predicted. And of course, you have men that try to predict the rapture, which, by the way, the word rapture is not found in the New Testament. Not only is the word rapture not found in the New Testament, the concept of the rapture is not found in the New Testament. Well, they say, well, it's the second coming. Okay, if you're talking about the second coming, that's a far different thing, because the second coming of Christ is taught in the New Testament. But the rapture, a so-called rapture theory, where some are left behind. You've heard of the book series Left Behind, the movie series Left Behind. Who was it? The guy that was in... there's an actor that played in the latest Left Behind movie who was in the Treasure series, the National Treasure series. Anyway, y'all can... Who was he? Thank you, Nicolas Cage. I can never remember his name. Nicolas Cage. You know, he was in the Left Behind movie. Well, the thing is, all this makes for good fiction. Good fiction. But it has nothing to do with the New Testament. You know, when you have Gregory Peck in the Omen movies, that's good fiction. Has nothing to do with what the book of Revelation teaches. Well, that's the reason why I keep on stressing and emphasizing what the Bible says in contradiction to what the premillennial theory says. And when you come to this section of Revelation, 17, 18, 19, and then in 20, it is so critical that we see what Revelation says as opposed to what current religious thought would have us believe. So, having said all that, we get into chapter 17. "And there came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials," actually it's bowls, "and taught with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore," or harlot, "that sitteth upon many waters." Now notice how this is described. This harlot, this prostitute, This great harlot is sitting on many waters. This is indicative of the fact that whatever this represents, whoever this represents, it holds great power over a large area of territory. Of course, I will just go ahead and tell you right up front, I firmly believe this is the Roman Empire. I have no doubt in my mind this is the Roman Empire because of the descriptions that are going to be given to this great harlot. And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, if you want to go see a good movie that you don't have to worry about as far as language or any kind of sexual things, go see Ben-Hur. Now, they're not showing it here in Montgomery. They are showing it in Prattville. We went to see it last night with Scott and Sherry, and it was an excellent movie. Don't believe what the critics have been saying about it because it is really an entertaining movie. Now, nothing matches Charlton Heston. I mean, let's face it. Charlton Heston is the man as far as the leading man is concerned. But the fellow that plays Judah Ben-Hur in this movie does a really good job in what he does. And also as far as Rome is concerned, Rome and Jerusalem and just the culture and depicting how life was, I think this movie is a lot more realistic than the 1959 version. And it's a very entertaining movie anyway. Now, the Jesus scenes fell flat for me. When Jesus is depicted on the big screen, he's either depicted as heroic Jesus, as was the case in The Passion of the Christ. Don't get me started on that movie. I hate that movie. But anyway, he's heroic Jesus, or he's anorexic Jesus, as was the case in the 1970s miniseries on NBC, where it looked like Jesus needed to eat a few donuts along the way because he was so skinny. Or then they will have, what is the other Jesus that they depict? Oh, the surfer Jesus. They have a guy that maybe is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, looks like come out of the beach. That was the case in the Bible miniseries. So you either have one of those three. Well, this one you have heroic Jesus. And the guy playing him, I don't know. The scenes didn't work for me. But at any rate, I gave it 4 out of 5 chariots. And you need to go see it if you want to go see a good, clean movie. But at any rate, why am I saying this? Because of this. Chapter 17, 18, and 19. Is talking about what is going to happen, of course, in the battle. But the description here about many waters is indicative of this universal sway. And Rome is the only thing that this can fit. The Jewish system can't fit this. Yes, Judaism was all throughout the empire, no question about it. But as far as political control, absolutely not. There's no way that you can fit this with the Judaic system. No way. Look further. With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Can you say that about Judaism? No. You can about Rome. And the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Can you say that truly about Judaism in the first century? No, you can't. Spiritual fornication? Maybe. But even at that, they were still teaching the one true God. They were teaching Jehovah. They were just teaching the Old Testament Judaism as being legitimate for the present day. And of course it wasn't. This is speaking about a system, some kind of political government system that was trying to induce people to commit spiritual fornication because Rome was all wrapped up in the gods and goddesses, the pantheon of gods and goddesses that they stole from Greece and then they adapted to their own. And then also literal fornication. Because if you know anything about Rome at this point, Rome was completely worldly. And that's an understatement. When you've got them celebrating all sorts of deviancy, and their poets and their playwrights celebrated deviancy, and didn't make any bones about it. Well, you've got this, of course, describing Rome itself. Verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. That I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This woman. Now, some would say, well, you see, there is Judaism sitting on the back of Rome. No, because the same kind of power that the woman has, the beast has. They go hand in glove. You're talking about a religious, quasi-religious system wrapped up, intertwined with a political system, which this can only describe Rome. Notice, it is a scarlet-colored beast. In this case, scarlet is indicative of wickedness. Think about a prostitute sitting on the back of a scarlet beast. And this beast, of course, would represent the emperor specifically, as was the case in Revelation 13 with the sea beast. Full of names of blasphemy. Now, full of names of blasphemy just means that she was shot through with it. She has no desire to follow the truth. She blasphemes everything about God and Christ. 7 heads. In this case, it's not indicative of divine, godly wisdom. 7 heads just means great wisdom in this context. The context of wickedness is just great wisdom. And 10 horns. Horns represents power. 10 horns, great power. And that is true with Rome. Rome was filled with intelligence, worldly wisdom. I mean, you look at what they accomplished. As far as their empire is concerned, they had a universal language, of course, Greek, which they adapted to their own. But they also had a universal method of transportation. All roads lead to Rome. You've heard that phrase? Well, that is very, very true. And many of the Roman roads that were built then are still in existence today. They were that well built. And then also the aqueducts. Many Roman aqueducts that were built way back then, some of them, I said many, some of them are still being used today. They still work. If the Roman Empire had gone on and not fallen, as it did, and it should have, and it did. But if it had not fallen, my hunch is that technology would have advanced a lot more quickly than it did. Because after Rome's fall, what happened? The Dark Ages. And people and society regresses technologically. If Rome had continued to prosper, technology would have advanced at a lot quicker rate than it did. But as it was, they were well advanced for their time. They were the only superpower, if you want to put it in those terms, during the first century. So, 7 heads, 10 horns. Verse 4, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color. Now, in this context, purple and scarlet represents wealth and splendor. In other words, she's just living in luxury, just opulent, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. If that doesn't describe the Roman Empire, I don't know what does. In other words, this cup that is full of abomination and filthiness is the history of her persecutions against the church, the history of her opposition to all things religious, everything wrapped up in that cup that she is holding. Now, there are those that would insist that this is Judaism, but I just don't see it. I just don't see it given the context of this. And notice what it says in verse 5. And upon her forehead was a name written. Now, prostitutes in the first century would quite often have their name written on their forehead. Now, they were that bold, that emblazoned. And so upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now, probably you have this in verse 5 in your translation capitalized. And that is for good reason. Because of the fact that this title, this name that's written on her forehead was written in all capital letters. That's the reason why the translators do that. Now in the text in this verse, in verse 5, you do not have capital letters necessarily. Because of the fact you've got some manuscripts that are written in all capitals, some manuscripts that are written in all small letters. But even in all those manuscripts, there's nothing to indicate that it was that way in the text. So it's the translator's decision to do that, which I think is a good choice. The King James Version has it capitalized, many other versions do too. That's to highlight what is written on her forehead. So, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now you see the woman is unmasked. When Christians in the first century read this, they would know exactly what's being described. They know exactly what's being described. You take an average Roman guard, when this passes through their sentry station, they take a look at it, and they look through this, and what is this all about? And they come to chapter 17, they see a prostitute on a beast and all these things, and they wouldn't have any clue what's being written. So they would let it go on. So that was an advantage of John writing in that kind of language to get it past the Roman authorities and get it to the people to whom it was intended. If he had just said out loud with no uncertain terms that Rome is being described here, Rome's going to fall, you don't think that would have brought the full weight of Rome on the church? You better believe it would have. So it was the wisdom of God to utilize this kind of language to write this message to the early church that was being persecuted by the Roman Empire. So, verse 6, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, the King James says, I wondered with great admiration. That is a total mistranslation of that word. John did not admire this woman. No. He looked at her, he wondered with a great wonder. That's what the text says. In other words, he just couldn't believe what he was seeing. King James Version makes it seem like John admired her. No, he didn't. John couldn't stand what he was seeing because he knew who this was. He wondered with a great wonder. He just couldn't believe what he was looking at. She's drunken with the blood of the saints. Literally, the text says she's drunk all the time. All the time with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. In other words, she's filling herself up with killing the saints and persecuting the church. Again, some of my brethren and some people would say that this is the Jewish system. I do not believe that at all. This doesn't fit. The overall context of this just does not fit Judaism. It fits perfectly the Roman Empire. There's no doubt about it. Now, some people would say this is the Roman Catholic Church. No. I understand where that's coming from, but that completely takes it out of the context of the first century, and it gives nothing to the brethren who are reading it in the first century any comfort to know that down about several hundred years from now, there's going to arise an apostate church that's going to do all this. I just don't see that. I do see this in connection with Rome, though. There's no question in my mind, at least, that overall context fits that perfectly. Verse 7, and the angel said unto me, wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. Notice this. 2 times in one verse, John, through inspiration, describes this beast who was and is not. And then he says, and now is. What does that refer to? There was a myth that was circulating throughout the Roman Empire called the Nero revived myth. Nero revividus, I believe is how it's pronounced in the Latin. In other words, the talk was that Nero didn't really die. That somehow he had been exiled somewhere east of the empire. He was waiting, biding his time to where he could triumphantly return and take control once again in Rome. Well, the fact was Nero was dead. Nero was dead. There's no reviving him. But the myth was there would be somebody, someone who would come in the same kind of attitude and spirit and disposition of Nero to take over. Well, was John aware of that? Possibly. Did the Holy Spirit choose that image to apply to the beast? No question about it. For whatever reason that the Holy Spirit or that God through Christ and the Holy Spirit chose this imagery, it's there. And it really fits perfectly when you're talking about the beast of Revelation in connection with the Roman emperors. Those who are Christians don't wonder. They do not wonder. They know that Rome is doomed by this point. And by the way, I did not make the point in verse 1. It says many waters. Think about it. Rome had sway over the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Aegean Sea. Had full sway over these many great seas and great waters. So this fits Rome to a T. So verse 9 beginning. Remember at the beginning of our study, I went over the list of emperors and how Revelation 17, as far as I'm concerned, tells us when Revelation was written. Here's where that passage is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Now, if language could not get any clearer in an apocalyptic book, this is pretty much nailing it down. The only thing that this could refer to is Rome. Rome was the city built on 7 hills. You remember in that slideshow that I showed at the beginning of our study, the different hills of Rome, the Capitoline Hill and the Esquiline Hill and all of those other hills. Well, 7 hills. Rome was built on 7 hills. It's not a coincidence that he describes it in that way. And there are 7 kings. Now again, as I pointed out at the beginning, the question is, where do you start in your list of kings? If this is describing the Roman Caesars, which there's no doubt that it is, where do you start? Some would start with Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar was never officially pronounced Caesar by the Roman Senate. They never did put that title on him until after his death. So when he was living, he was not really a Caesar in the same way the rest of them were. So most of your list of Caesars don't begin with Julius. It begins with Augustus. So if you begin with Augustus, you have Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, and Titus. Now, if you remember, between Nero and Vespasian, from about 68 to 69, there are 3 men that vie for the throne, which would be Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius battled against each other for about 1.5 years. They never could get sway over one another. Most of your records of those days do not even recognize Galba, Otho, and Vitellius as legitimate Caesars, because none of them really took control. Well, what happened was Titus was, Vespasian that is, Vespasian was besieging Jerusalem at this point. Then all this trouble happens in Rome and nobody can get a handle on the situation. So the powers that be in Rome called Vespasian back from Jerusalem. Vespasian left the siege to his son Titus. Vespasian comes back to Rome and takes control of the situation. And then he is named Caesar in about 69 AD. And he rules for about 10 years until his death. And then his son Titus ascends the throne. He reigns for about 3 years, the shortest term for any legitimate Caesar, by the way. He is poisoned, likely by his brother Domitian, who then takes the throne for 15 years. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. 7 mountains, or 7 kings, 5 are fallen. This will be Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And 1 is, that would be Vespasian. And the other is not yet come, that would be Titus. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Titus only reigned, as we have said, for about 3 years. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. The beast that was and is not is Domitian. It's my firm belief. Domitian is the little horn of Daniel. He is the one that Daniel saw in his vision. He is the fulfillment of this. He is the one that would reign for 15 years with a reign of terror over the imperial Senate. He reigned with a reign of terror over all of his enemies. I think the more that comes out about Domitian and archaeological digs, the more we're going to get a full picture of this guy. He was a piece of work. There's no doubt about it. He demanded that people address him as Lord and God, as we have mentioned before. He thought of himself as deity on earth. He appropriated to himself these titles and these figures. And the great statue of Domitian that is now, of course, in pieces, gives you an idea of how this guy thought of himself when the forearm of the statue is taller than many average-sized men. Just the forearm. There's not many men that would have a statue commissioned about themselves that big. Domitian was one such fellow. Nobody was sad to see him go, by the way, when he finally met his end. No one was sad to see him die. And the fact is, he reigned with the rule of terror over the empire. Now, I do understand that there are those that have overblown the case for Domitian. Ray Summers, in his commentary, Worthy as the Lamb, one of my favorite commentaries on Revelation, nevertheless goes overboard. When talking about Rome's persecution of the church under Domitian. And he uses hyperbole that really doesn't fit the text. But having said that, there's enough evidence about the way Domitian was to know that he did persecute his enemies, including those in the church. There are those in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that write about Domitian in that way. So, verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power or authority as kings 1 hour with the beast. Again, this stresses the political scope of the beast and of his reign, his authority. This indicates the power of the empire. These are rulers of the provinces of Rome that receive their authority and power from Rome itself and from Domitian in particular. They receive and enjoy authority for a very short period of time, specifically against the church itself. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. In other words, they obey everything the beast says. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. King of kings, Lord of lords. Very appropriate in describing Jesus Christ. There's no way that these people can overcome him. He is the Lamb, yes. But as has already been described, he is also the Lion of the tribe of Judah. There's no way that these individuals can overcome him. So notice that last phrase. Those who are with him are called. 2 Thessalonians 2:14 indicates that we are called through the gospel. They are chosen. Ephesians 1:4 indicates that we are chosen, those of us who are Christians. And faithful. Revelation 2:10 already indicated. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. So that describes us as well as it describes them in the first century. Called, chosen, faithful. That's what we must be. And he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. 4 groups mentioned here, indicative, of course, the number 4 being the number for the earth, the worldwide scope of Rome's empire. But one weakness, a major weakness of Rome, was the inability of Rome to truly unite different nationalities and different ethnic groups. Rome prided herself on being able to be a great melting pot. Sound familiar? A great melting pot for all cultures and languages and religions. Just come in to the great melting pot of Rome and you can worship the gods that we worship. You can have the same kind of system that we have. We can all become Romans, as it were. Well, the major flaw in that was they failed to take into consideration nationalities. and the loyalties of ethnic groups to their nations. In fact, Daniel 2:42 indicates that about the big image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. The feet were partly of iron and partly clay. The kingdom would be partly strong and partly broken. Speaking of Rome, Rome's weakness was its inability to really have a totally unified empire. There, for a period of time in the first century, there was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But it was a peace that had some rumblings underneath, because they never could get a hold of the eastern border completely. They never could fully get a hold of the barbaric tribes to the north, the Germanic tribes. They always had trouble in Germania and other areas. They never really could get it all together, and it came back to bite them in the end. No question about it. So verse 16. The 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. You've heard the phrase, a falling out among thieves. That's exactly what happens with Rome eventually. They have a falling out among all these different nationalities. Rome's judgment is in part at the hand of other nations. It gets to the point where the barbaric tribes in the north and the east have their way with the Roman Empire. I believe it was Edward Gibbon that indicated by the time Rome fell, Roman soldiers at the hinterlands were not putting their armor on because it was too heavy and it made them too hot. Well, if a Roman soldier didn't have his armor on, he was opening himself up for disaster. And that's exactly what eventually happened. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill His will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. This is indicative of the providence of God at work. God utilizes wicked men, has utilized wicked men to fulfill His promises and His purposes. You know, sometimes we look at the current state of affairs in American politics and sometimes we wonder, where is God in all this? Well, you can be sure that God's hand is at work providentially. Whatever happens, God will be in control. What happens to the United States? That's another question altogether. It's in God's hands. Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents, in my mind, the greatest president we've ever had. Abraham Lincoln wrestled with all these questions of what God was thinking, or where God was in the great conflict between the North and the South. And he wrote about these matters and even talked about them in his, especially in his second inaugural address. He wrestled with those questions. And we need to wrestle with those questions. Where is God? If one side or another wins, where is God in this? Well, God's still where He's always been. He's on His throne. He's still reigning. He's still over all. His purposes will be accomplished no matter who sits in the White House. His purposes will be accomplished no matter who controls the House and the Senate or the Supreme Court. His will be fulfilled, whatever happens in politics. And His will was fulfilled right here in the first century. And it was fulfilled through ungodly people. Even though they weren't aware of it, His purposes was being fulfilled through that. Well, verse 18, appropriate place to stop. The woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. The great city. Not Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't reign over the kings of the earth. Rome did. Rome reigned over the kings of the earth. Notice it's a great city. It's not a great church. It's not the Roman Catholic Church. Yes, Roman Catholic Church is in Rome. No question about it. He's not talking about the Catholic Church. He's talking about Rome, the empire. She reigned over the kings of the earth. And she is coming down. There's no question about it. The outcome of the battle has already been announced. There's no doubt about it. She's going to be destroyed. And the church, God's purposes, will be fulfilled and will be triumphant. All right, this is as good